All right. Hello. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our packing and holding webinar. My name is Sarah Music. I am the produce safety coordinator. I do education, outreach, and farm inventory. So I hold webinars. I do PSA grower trainings, on-farm readiness reviews, and everything else in between. So we will get started here. This is the agenda. These are the things that we'll kind of be going over. So we will be going over packing, not only the definition of packing, but what it means under the produce safety rules, some of the things that you should consider when you're packing, and then also holding. So again, the definition, and again, what it means underneath the produce safety rule. We have seen quite a bit of confusion during the registration process of people understanding what packing and holding means, because it could mean different things for different people. So we will be covering those. We will touch on pack houses and agricultural water specifically, records and resources that we have. And then, of course, if you have any questions at the end, feel free to either put them in the chat or come off mute at that time in order to do so. So we're going to just dive right in. We're going to go right into packing here. So this is the definition. I didn't do the legal one, but this is what it's getting at. It's packing means placing produce into a container other than the packaging that you're using, and the activities that are incidental to packing that they also consider packing, at least under the produce safety rule. If you do any sorting, culling, grading, weighing, if you repack as well. So if you pack in the field and then repack in a pack house, that's still considered packing. What it doesn't include is anything in the processing. So if you're transforming your produce into, if you're doing apples and you're making it into cider, it's not considering anything past the packing stage. So any of the processing that you would do there, it's just talking about putting the produce into a container and then what that looks like. So this is kind of where we see a lot of the confusion. This is where packing, at least with the produce safety rule, where we see the confusion is that it could occur in a couple different places. It can occur just field packing or inside a pack house. So as far as like in the field, if you harvest something, put it on a trailer, and if it's taken to a cooler, or I do know that there are some growers out there that they harvest specifically, I'm thinking like chili peppers. What they do is they harvest into like a white little container, and then they put it into 40-pound bags, and those 40-pound bags are then put onto a truck, and that truck takes them to whoever the end user is, whether that's the farm stand, whether that's a different warehouse, distribution center, whatever that looks like for people. But that is what is considered packing. So field packing is something that is considered packing under the rule, even if it's taken to a different place. So if you're doing field packing, that's what we're talking about. As far as inside of a pack house, what kind of pack house do we mean? What does that look like? It could look a multiple different ways. The two big ones that we typically see is open and closed. Open meaning that it's open to the environment. You may have heard of like 4 sticks and a lid. So anything along those lines, or typical of pack houses that I see that are like open to the elements, is that they have like their wash station outside, but then their cooler is in what we would consider like a pack house or like a big building. So either one of these we would consider a pack house, and if you have one, we would probably consider you packing as well. And then of course closed, so it has, a door, windows, right? It has 4 walls, and you have the ability to control who's coming in and coming out of the building. As far as reducing your risk, right? We want to be able to do that before we hit the packing stage. There's a few things that you can do. One of them being cleaning harvest bins, making sure that your workers, when they're harvesting, that especially if it's going from the field to whoever is going to be consuming it, making sure that any harvest bins don't have any soil in them or dirt in them, or any kind of what we would call like animal intrusion. So if you see any like mouse poop in there or bird's nests or anything like those, like that. So then that way your workers should feel comfortable telling you, hey, it looks like this bin hasn't been at least cleaned, and then setting it to the side so that way it doesn't become a contamination source for your produce. Something that we always encourage too when you're harvesting is that that harvest bin doesn't come into contact with the soil because again, if you're, traipsing it through a harvest field, and you're setting that harvest bin down into the soil, there could be animal feces there that you may not see, and then you're putting something that would be considered a food contact surface, which we will be going over in our May webinar. So hopefully you come back in May for that one. But so food contact surfaces. So having what we call a sacrifice bin. So having something below that, or I've seen people makeshift a like wheelbarrow of sorts. So that way it's not coming into contact with the soil. And especially if you're reusing these bins as your packing containers, is making sure to reduce your risk, right? So you want to reduce the risk of contamination, especially if it's muddy and you're slogging through things. If you are using water to wash your produce, it helps to eliminate a little bit of that organic load, not all of it, especially those things grown in the ground. It's just going to have soil on it regardless. If you think like onions and carrots and radishes and those kind of things. It may also help as especially if you're using batch water or recirculated water, which we'll get into in a little bit later. It could help with the frequency and you wouldn't have to change the water as much. And then, of course, the risk when stacking bins, that's the big one, right? Especially if you're packing them in the field, especially those harvest bins, if something was sitting in the ground and then you're now stacking it, that could potentially cause produce to come in contact with something that it shouldn't. So again, things to kind of consider, especially if you don't repack or sort or do any of that. Just things to kind of consider for if you are actually doing packing. As far as packing containers go, nothing in the rule says that you can't use reusable ones. There's different risks, pros and cons to using either or. You can use a new single-use container. So typical of the one that you see there on the bottom there, where it's cardboard box. I know a lot of people use the ones that are wax sealed, so then that way the cardboard doesn't disintegrate. Or you can use cleaned reusable containers, or I do know that there are growers out there that use harvest bins for both not only harvesting, but then also packing as well, just because of the volume that they do. You can do that. Nothing says you can't. Just you have to make sure that any material that you're using or any containers that you use, they need to be stored in a place where nothing is going to contaminate them. So in a covered area, so that way birds can't nest in them, birds can't poop in them, mice can't get in them and, chew on them or anything. And then also, again, off the floor as well, we typically say like wooden pallets, or sometimes if we're talking like those big harvest bins, especially where you see in like orchard harvests, right? Most of them, like they have like the foot, right? So long as you have that, keeping it up off the ground, that your harvest bin doesn't completely go to the floor, that's fine as well. But especially with those harvest bins, especially the ones that I have seen, like the black ones with the holes on the bottom, yeah, making sure that those are up off the ground in a covered area. So then that way, pests can't get in there. And then also, right, making sure your containers aren't contaminated before using them. And that also goes for your single use, right? Because I know that growers buy them in bulk. So sometimes they might buy like 1 to 2 years at a time. So making sure when you're pulling them out of storage that you're checking to make sure that there's no contamination. That could even be like if you had a roof leak and some of the boxes got wet, not using them, or if you see any kind of evidence of animal intrusion, if they chewed through the plastic and got to the cardboard to make their nests or anything along those lines, just, training your workers to go hey, you need to kind of look to make sure that the boxes are in good shape before using them. So that is all packing. Very pretty straightforward, but yes, we also consider packing field packing. Now we're going to head into holding and what we consider holding. So the definition and kind of going into a little bit more in depth as far as that goes. So again, holding is pretty straightforward as far as the definition. It's just the storage of food, and it can include activities such as fumigating, drying, and dehydrating when you're not creating a distinct commodity, meaning like the big example of that is usually when you dry down grapes, they become raisins. So that would be a distinct commodity. But if you're just dehydrating, strawberries, or typically where we see this is with mushrooms or anything along those lines, that's what it's talking about as far as holding. And then this one, we typically see the second bullet here, activities performed as far as blending of produce and breaking down pallets. Typically where I see this is with larger growers. Where they just kind of pull everything into one place. The best one that I can kind of think of is onions typically. So they usually, harvest them, pack them into like a harvest bin, take them to a warehouse of some kind, and then they're just blending all the onions together in one big storage area where they can stay up to 24 hours, up to a couple months. So that's kind of what they mean by that of like blending a produce of that. You're taking all of your harvest bins, putting it into one area, if that's something that you do as well. That would be considered holding. As far as holding facilities go, this is directly from the rule. These are the ones that are considered holding facilities. So if you have a warehouse, cold storage, storage silos, grain elevators, if they're used to store any kind of produce, usually where we see confusion is with holding is that if you have a cooler, you're holding. There is no determinate amount of time of holding produce that is not considered holding. If you're holding it, a lot of people are like, well, I don't hold it for, I hold it for less than 24 hours. I'm not holding. At least as far as the produce safety rule is concerned, you would be. So if you're holding it even for, your distributors coming in the morning, or it's going to be there for just a couple hours, even if it's held in just one part of your building or warehouse or facility, wherever that may be, is still considered holding underneath the produce safety rule. And this is where we see a lot of the confusion. But the big one is if you do have cold storage or a cooler, you are holding. So cold storage areas, or i.e. a cooler, things to kind of consider if this is something that you either have or something that you are considering having, is making sure that you're inspecting it on a regular basis. It doesn't mean that you have to check it, 5 times a day or anything, but making sure that it's clean, that your cooling equipment is functioning properly, right? That it's not becoming a source of contamination. The big one that we see, or I instruct our inspectors to kind of look for, is where the fans are, or where the cooler is, and the condensation. Is there a drip pan? Can anything drip onto the produce? So any of those, like the fans in a cooler, typically I would have a conversation with a grower just to be like, I would recommend not having produce at all under here just because of the risk with that. And we'll kind of get into that as far as the ag water portion of this presentation. But yeah, so making sure that condensation isn't dripping. Seals are intact around the doors and windows, especially if you're wanting to keep that cool air in there. And then especially if you're wanting to make sure that it's at a certain temperature, you need to make sure that you're monitoring that and then recording it at the beginning of the day. That's going to be your best indicator of how well your equipment is functioning, especially if you want to keep it at, typically what I hear, depending on how cold you want it, depending on what produce you grow, typically between, 35 and 39 is typically what I hear. Some do a little bit colder just for quality, just with the things that they're growing. But if you start to see that temperature, even if it's, that door's been closed for 8 hours, creeping in, if you're wanting it set at 35 and it's at 45, that might indicate to you, oh, there might be something wrong with my equipment and I might need to work on that. So also, I do want to point out that the rule doesn't require that you do cooling. But if you do, you have to make sure that the produce isn't going to become contaminated if you are using a cooler. So kind of keep that in mind as well, that you don't have to use a cooler, but if you do, there are certain things that you'd have to consider. Another big one, and this kind of goes into both packing and holding. Typically, especially if you have a pack house, most of the time it's you have the pack line and then it gets, put on a pallet. That pallet is forklifted into a cooler of some kind. So pest management, this one kind of goes into both, especially if you have a pack house that does packing and holding. So definitely some things to kind of consider, especially as far as like the building itself, the building maintenance is making sure to like check walls, doors, and windows and repair when you need to. Specifically with doors and windows, all a mouse needs is 1/4 of an inch. So if you see like a speck of light anywhere, that might be something to think about that, ooh, that's big enough that a mouse can get in. And if there's one mouse, there's probably 100. So kind of keep that in mind. And then a big one is birds and deterring them from nesting. I know a lot of people have those like I call them like the truck, like garage doors. So those like big doors on their um pack houses. So a lot of them say it's only open when we're bringing a truck in. Those doors stay closed, and one of the reasons why is because it deters birds. It doesn't allow them an opportunity to be able to come in to nest. If you do start to see any kind of nesting or any kind of evidence of birds getting in, is to make sure your doors are closed behind you. Any of those like big doors are closed as well, because it takes like less than 24 hours for birds to be able to rebuild a nest. So kind of keep that in mind. How you deter them is up to you. You can use nets, you can use spikes, anything along those lines to kind of keep them from nesting, especially if you have an open pack house. And especially if you have eaves where they could easily just kind of roost there, is something to think about. And then, of course, I just touched on this, keeping your doors and windows closed as much as possible. And then not only the inside of the building, but the outside of the building as well. I know a lot of places they put gravel around their buildings just because it helps with weed management. But if that's not something that you can do, that's okay. But something you need to consider is making sure on some kind of regular basis that you are maintaining the weeds around your pack house, or I've even seen this with greenhouses as well, because if you don't maintain the weeds short, mice and all the other little rodents would like to use it as cover, so then that way predators can't see them. And then again, if they find just one little hole in your building, that's where they're getting in. They get to snack on your yummy produce and then kind of be able to live that way. So keep that in mind. Another one is removing coal piles and garbage every day, making sure that it's put into a dumpster. So that way, again, because those are big places where pests are usually drawn to, not only just like our little mice friends, but also raccoons as well. And depending on how urban or rural you are, you could be attracting other bigger things as well, bears or anything else. So keep that in mind. And then also, of course, keeping produce covered if that is possible, because again, it kind of deters them from being able to get into your produce. Putting a cover on top of it, or even I've seen people, they put like cardboard over their bins if possible, or they just check for animal intrusion if there is any. And then also if it is in a cooler, and they have to put it under like a their condenser, they put like thick sheets of plastic over it because not only to protect it from the water, but protect it from pests coming in. Something that if that is an avenue that you want to do, that's fine. But I would also just encourage you if there is any water on the top that you're not splashing it onto the produce in the bins below. Um, Again, you don't have to cover your produce, but again, it's just like mitigating your risk, especially if you know that there's pests or mice and stuff in your area. And then of course, if you have a pest control program, make sure that you're controlling the pests that you actually have. While it would be great if you set up mouse traps and you have a diagram of where they are, but if you aren't getting many mice, but you're seeing more like voles and prairie dogs or birds, making sure that the pest control program that you have in place is actually controlling what you need to. So kind of keep that in mind as well as like what animals are in the area, what do I need to be concerned with. So another one that kind of gets left off a lot of times is transportation. Now, this isn't part of holding, but it's always something that I like to bring up to people so then that way they can understand the risks here as well is that you don't want to do all this hard work of your harvesting, you packed all your stuff and cardboard boxes or in your harvest bins, and then you held it in your cooler and made sure that the condensation didn't get on your produce, and then you're going to put it into a back of a truck. Making sure that you don't drop the ball right there at the 1 yard line, right? So ideally, the transportation vehicle that you use to transport your produce wherever that may be, that could be to a farmer's market, that could be to a food hub, distribution center, whatever that looks like for you. Ideally, that vehicle only transports produce. It eliminates a lot of your risk, especially because of this second bullet here. We do understand that growers have vehicles that have multiple purposes and that it has to be used that way. There just isn't money to have maybe a truck to carry produce and then another truck to do haul livestock if that's something that you do, or even compost or dirty equipment or anything in the back of that truck. If you are using a vehicle that has other purposes, what you need to do is you need to clean and sanitize before produce gets put in there. Again, if produce is in those harvest bins that have the bottoms where there's those white spaces, it could potentially come into contact with the bottom of the truck or even the sides, which then potentially makes it a food contact surface. So another shameless plug for our May webinar. But that is something to consider. There's multiple other things that you could do. You could put a liner down in the truck bed to make sure that it doesn't come into contact. Or also, I do know that some growers buy their own refrigerator truck, or cooler truck, whichever verbiage that you use. Again, with those, there's some risk there, making sure that it's working properly, right? So if it's refrigerated and needs to be at a certain temperature, that it's doing that. Making sure to not, especially if they use one of those AC units, that you're not putting anything underneath. Again, because if water drips on that, it could potentially contaminate your produce. And then if you bought the truck, then you know when it was last swept because you're recording that, you know when it was cleaned and or sanitized. If you are having to do a third party, I know some people they rent a refrigerator truck, which again, you can totally do, but having something in the contract of making sure that it's swept out before it's brought to you, that the coolant, if you are using a refrigerated truck, that it's at the temperature that you want it at. And another thing of like, does it have any odd smells? Right? Especially if the refrigerator truck, it may have come from a place where meat was in there last. So making sure that nothing in that transportation vehicle is going to contaminate your produce. And then again, of course, with transportation, if you can, keeping it off the bed, especially in a cooler truck, having pallets in there, and then also away from the walls. So then again, it's eliminating a little bit of risk there. So now we're going to kind of revert back a little bit and we're going to go into agricultural water and what you'll see in a pack house. So, what do I mean by ag water? It means agricultural water. And at least with the produce safety rule, this is the definition of it. So, any water that comes into contact with the harvestable portion of the crop. And since this webinar is about packing and holding, that means that the agricultural water I'm talking about is just harvest and post-harvest. So for harvest and post-harvest water, it also has a requirement that that water needs to have no detectable generic E. coli in a 100 milliliter sample, but it has to have no detectable generic E. coli and no untreated surface water can be used. As far as ag water use, these are the big ones that we typically see on an inspection or an educational visit. These are the things that we're seeing, right? So if you're cooling your produce, that also means ice. So if you use ice or ice slurries, making sure that that agricultural water meets these requirements. And then also something, because I don't think a lot of people think about it, is how often the ice machine is cleaned. So making sure that that is not becoming a contamination source. So making sure that that is cleaned before making ice. So then that way it's not becoming a contamination source. And then if you're using a shovel, making sure that shovel isn't put on the ground or put somewhere where again it becomes a contamination point. So again, kind of keep that in mind if you're wanting to use ice, that there's things to kind of consider with that. Washing produce, this is the big one that we typically see. It can be a bunch of different ways that you can do that. Most of the time I see washing produce is with leafy greens. That's the big one, but it's not the only one. I do see sometimes with orchards. I know some people may wash their cherries or plums or apples or anything along those lines. So it's like a belt and a sprayer, anything along those lines, especially cleaning and sanitizing. Again, May webinar will go over like food contact surfaces, what proper and cleaning and sanitizing looks like, but making sure that you're using a brush and soap and really cleaning something before putting sanitizer on it. And then the big one, right, especially with workers, proper hand washing. You know, if they're washing their hands, especially because they will be touching the produce, typically, unless you use full mechanical, they're the ones that are touching the produce. So making sure that they have a hand washing facility and water that isn't contaminated. And then, of course, food contact surfaces. Again, this could be with cleaning, but then also, especially if it's run through a pack line, making sure that all of that can be cleaned and sanitized. So I know I may have slightly touched on this, but typically what you see as far as those that use water, I do want to emphasize that you do not have to use water in packing or holding. However, if you do use water, there's risks with that. And there's certain things that you would have to do depending on what kind of water you're using. Meaning, is it going to be a single pass or are you recirculating that water? You're using it. Typically, I've seen either like a chlorine solution or a sanidate to treat that water, especially with a recirculated or batch water situation, just depending on what you're wanting to do. Water just adds risk. So I know a lot of people are like, I don't use water in my pack house or my holding facility just because the risk is too high, and that's okay. But if this is something that you wanted to consider, these are the things that you would have to think about. As far as single pass, it just needs to meet that harvest and post-harvest ag water requirement, right? The no detectable generic E. coli, no untreated water. Typically in a pack house, I have typically seen either well water being used or municipal. Most of the time it's municipal, but just depending on where you are in the state, well may only be your option. And that's okay. So long as you can show that it has that no detectable generic E. coli, that's okay. As far as municipal, all you would have to do is get records showing that it meets the drinking water standards that the EPA set forth. Because if it meets the drinking water standards, it meets the produce safety rules requirements for harvest and post-harvest water. And you can get that from your local city and county or whatever your municipal water source is. So that's for single pass because the assumption is you wash it once, you use it once, and then it gets disposed of. With recirculated and batch, there's a little bit more that you kind of have to think about. It does have to meet harvest and post-harvest requirements in the beginning. However, you do need to maintain safe and adequate sanitary quality throughout the use that you're using it. You can treat the water. A lot of people, what they do is they have a line and it pipes in exactly how much sanidate needs to be in the water for what the level is of their water that it needs to be. But it doesn't, you aren't required to use it. However, it helps to reduce your cross-contamination risk. So if there was anything on your equipment or on your produce, it's not cross-contaminating all the way down. So again, something to consider. The big thing with the produce safety rule is that if you are using recirculated or batch water, you have to have a schedule that you need to establish for changing that batch water. What is your standard for that? And this is something that I will ask, but then it will also be something an inspector will ask. Okay, it looks like you're using water to wash your produce. How often is it being changed? How do you know that it's, where you want it to be? That could be you're checking the turbidity of the water. You could be checking the pH of the water. As far as turbidity goes, there's multiple different ways you can check that. Most people say if I can't see the bottom of the wash bin, it gets changed, or a lot of people, especially if you're growing multiple different things, it could be that after so if they grow like leafy greens, carrots, tomatoes, they will do leafy greens first. They'll start with their cleanest and then go to their dirtiest. So like carrots, because they come from soil, they're done last. And so they'll do leafy greens first. And then they'll do like their tomatoes and then cucumbers and etc. and kind of work through that. So they do it by their produce type. You're welcome to do that, but not required. If you are checking turbidity, however you want to do that, there are turbidity meters out there or something called a Secchi disc. And it's about this big and it's got like black and white little checkers around it. And what it's meant to be is you're supposed to put it into your bin, and when you cannot see it, it means the water is turbid enough that the water should be changed. So, but whatever that schedule looks like for you, you're more than welcome to do that. But so long as you have something to go on and you'd be able to explain and justify why you're doing that, then that works. So something I always like to touch on because I don't think it's touched on enough is disposal of used water, especially if it's being put down a drain. Making sure that you're allowed to do that, making sure that it's being disposed of properly. Some people, especially if they have like an open pack house, the water is put into a drain and then that drain feeds out into a field. So making sure that that field doesn't contaminate your growing fields, that way you aren't having issues with that, or also that it's not going to contaminate another surface water source. So it's not being drained into a field, which then is getting drained into a surface water source. So kind of keeping that in mind of like, where is it being drained if you aren't connected into a drain and it's being put out, by the city kind of thing. And then that kind of ties into the hand washing station. So if you have a bathroom that's connected to a drain, that's fine. However, just depending on different pack houses, they may not have a bathroom attached. So having a hand washing station and making sure that it has a catch basin. So again, that used water isn't going to get into a field and cause contamination. So something to kind of keep in mind as well. If you are using sanitizer, I would even say specifically bleach. Check the EPA regulations. They have the chlorine has to reach a certain level of ppms before you can discharge it into any kind of water source. I think it's 0.01 parts per million. So you may have to dilute your sanitizer or bleach in order to meet EPA state or local regulations. So I would highly encourage you to kind of check that out so that way you're remaining compliant in that. Something else as well, since I mentioned drains, is making sure that they are draining properly. One of the big things that we see in pack houses, especially if it's, if you got a clog and then all of a sudden standing water, is that's a big one. That's a really big breeding ground for listeria. That's where we've seen outbreaks occur, and specifically the one that happened down in Rocky Ford in 2011 with the listeria outbreak. One of the things is that there was a lot of standing water because the drains weren't draining properly. So kind of keep that in mind as well, is everything in working order if you are disposing of your used water. So as far as resources and records, our 2024 annual report does have ag water resources in it, and then also it has the record templates. Some of the records that you would have to keep as far as packing and holding goes would be like that cleaning and sanitizing. If you are keeping monitoring temperature, you would have to have that temperature log. That'd be something. If you have a fully enclosed pack house, your pest management records, anything along those lines would be something that we would be looking at. And then as far as like the agricultural water or your ag water, that one they would have to see that it meets the no detectable generic E. coli. So if you have a municipal water source, just the records from your city or county municipal water stating that it meets the EPA standards, or if you have a well, that it meets the no detectable generic E. coli. Any of the other resources or anything can be found on our website as well. But that is it. Here's our contact information. Dwayne Sinning is the program manager. He wasn't able to attend today, but his information is there, and then mine's there at the bottom. So of course, if you have any questions or concerns or anything, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to walk you through all of that. So with that, I will stop recording.